The X-ray technician was silent, staring at the screen with a look Claire had never seen before. Something in the image looked alive. Not metaphorically alive. Not in the sense that doctors sometimes say a tumor is aggressive or a wound is healing beautifully. This was different. This was movement captured in a still frame, a presence where there should have been only bone and tissue and shadow. Claire Morrison had worked at St. E.'s, Benedict's Regional Hospital in Portland, Oregon, for 7 years, processing thousands of images, and she had never seen Michael Davis freeze like this. His hand hovered over the mouse, trembling slightly, and when he finally turned to look at her, his face had drained of all color. She stepped closer to the monitor, squinting at the chest X-ray of a patient named Thomas Whitmore, a 72-year-old man admitted 3 days ago with pneumonia. The lungs showed the expected cloudiness, the ribs curved in their familiar cage pattern, and the heart sat in its proper position. But there, in the upper left quadrant, near where the shoulder met the chest wall, was something that made Claire's breath catch in her throat. It looked like a face. Not a pareidolia trick of light and shadow that the human brain sometimes conjures from random patterns, but an actual face with distinct features, eyes that seemed to stare directly out of the image, a mouth opened as if caught mid-scream. Michael finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, asking if she saw it too, and Claire nodded slowly because lying would have been pointless. They both saw it. They both knew they saw it. And worse, they both recognized something in those eyes, a desperate plea or a warning they couldn't quite understand. The image had been taken at 2:30 in the morning during Claire's night shift, a time when the hospital transformed from its daytime chaos into something quieter and stranger. She had wheeled Thomas Whitmore down from the intensive care unit herself. His breathing labored even with the oxygen mask, his eyes closed, and his weathered hands folded across his chest. He hadn't spoken during the transfer, hadn't even opened his eyes when she positioned him carefully on the X-ray table. She remembered thinking he looked peaceful despite his illness, like a man who had made peace with whatever was coming next. The procedure had been routine, standard anterior-posterior and lateral views of the chest, nothing she hadn't done 1,000 times before. She had stepped behind the protective barrier, pressed the button, heard the familiar quick buzz of the machine capturing its invisible photograph, and then helped Thomas back into his wheelchair. He had opened his eyes then, just briefly, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not fear exactly, but something close to it, mixed with resignation and perhaps a hint of relief. She had asked if he was all right, and he had nodded once before closing his eyes again. The whole interaction had lasted maybe 15 seconds, but now, standing in front of this impossible image, those 15 seconds played in her mind over and over like a loop she couldn't escape. Michael was pulling up Thomas Whitmore's file on the computer, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard despite their shaking. The medical history loaded slowly, line by line, revealing a man who had lived a full and apparently unremarkable life. Retired postal worker, widowed for 6 years, 2 grown children living in Seattle, no unusual medical conditions beyond the expected wear of age and a lifetime of smoking. There were notes from the attending physician about the pneumonia, observations about decreased breath sounds on the left side, orders for antibiotics and supportive care. Nothing that would explain what they were seeing on the screen. Claire leaned in closer, studying the face in the X-ray with a strange mixture of scientific curiosity and primal unease. The features were too detailed to be accidental, too human to be anything else. She could make out what looked like strands of hair, the curve of a cheekbone, even what might have been tears on the cheeks. It was a woman's face, she realized with sudden certainty. A woman who looked to be in her 30s or 40s, and she was terrified. The expression was unmistakable, pure fear frozen in time and captured somehow inside another person's body. Michael was saying something about calling the radiologist, about getting a second opinion, about maybe there being a technical glitch with the equipment, but his words sounded hollow even to himself. They both knew this wasn't a technical glitch. This was something else entirely. Something that didn't belong in their world of machines and medicine and rational explanations. Claire found herself reaching for the pendant she wore around her neck, a small silver cross her grandmother had given her before she died. She wasn't particularly religious, hadn't been to church in years except for weddings and funerals. But right now she needed something to hold on to, some tangible reminder that there were forces in the universe beyond what could be seen and measured. Michael was talking about protocols now, about hospital policy for unusual findings, about documentation and chain of custody for medical images. His voice had taken on a mechanical quality, as if by following procedure he could somehow make this normal, make this fit into the boxes and categories they were trained to use. But Claire wasn't listening anymore. She was thinking about Thomas Whitmore lying in his bed 3 floors above them, breathing his labored breaths, dreaming whatever dreams came to old men in hospital beds at night. She was thinking about the face in his chest, the woman trapped somehow in his body or his bones or his soul, and she was wondering what it meant. Was it a memory made manifest? Was it someone he had lost? Someone he had loved or hurt or failed to save? Or was it something darker? Something that had nothing to do with Thomas Whitmore at all, but had simply chosen him as its vessel, its way of making itself known to the living world. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that constant background noise of hospitals that nobody notices until they suddenly do. Claire became aware of how quiet the radiology department was at this hour, how empty the hallways outside must be, how alone they were down here with their impossible discovery. Michael had stopped talking and was staring at the image again, his face now showing not just fear but something else, something that looked almost like recognition. She asked him what he was thinking, and he hesitated for a long moment before answering. He told her about a case from his previous hospital, a place in Sacramento where he had worked before moving to Portland. There had been a patient, a middle-aged man who had come in after a car accident, and in his CT scan they had found something similar. Not a face exactly, but patterns that shouldn't have been there, shapes that looked almost intentional. The man had died 2 days later, despite his injuries not being severe enough to be fatal, and Michael had always wondered if there was a connection, if somehow the strange images had been a warning, or a sign of something medical science didn't understand. He had never told anyone about it before because it sounded insane, because doctors and technicians were supposed to deal in facts and evidence, not supernatural speculation. But now, looking at this face staring out from Thomas Whitmore's chest, he couldn't stay silent anymore. Claire made a decision then that would change everything. She told Michael to save the image file with a timestamp and her initials, to document it properly, but not to report it to the radiologist yet. She wanted to go upstairs and check on Thomas Whitmore first, wanted to see him with her own eyes, and maybe, if he was awake, ask him some questions. Michael looked uncertain, reminding her that protocol required immediate reporting of any unusual findings, but she could see in his eyes that he was just as curious as she was, just as desperate to understand what they were seeing. They agreed to go together, leaving the radiology department with its humming machines and flickering monitors behind them. The elevator ride to the intensive care unit felt longer than usual, the walls seeming to close in slightly with each passing floor. Neither of them spoke, both lost in their own thoughts about what they had seen and what it might mean. When the doors finally opened on the 4th floor, they were greeted by the familiar sounds of the ICU at night, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the soft swoosh of ventilators, the occasional murmur of nurses conferring quietly at their station. E agora parecia ainda mais nítido. Aquela forma escura não era apenas uma anomalia técnica ou uma falha de processamento. Era uma presença. Everything seemed normal on the surface, but Claire felt as if she were seeing it all through a different lens now, as if the discovery of that face had somehow peeled back a layer of reality to reveal something stranger underneath. Thomas Whitmore's room was at the end of the corridor, a private space with large windows that during the day would show views of the hospital's courtyard garden, but now only reflected the room's dim lighting back at itself. Claire knocked softly, even though she knew he was probably asleep, a habit born from years of respecting patient privacy even in moments of urgency. There was no answer, so she pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside with Michael close behind her. The room was filled with the usual apparatus of critical care: IV poles with multiple bags dripping medication into Thomas's veins, a monitor displaying his vital signs in glowing green numbers, an oxygen concentrator humming quietly in the corner. Thomas himself lay propped up slightly on pillows, his breathing still labored but regular, his eyes closed and his face relaxed in sleep. He looked exactly as Claire remembered from just an hour ago, nothing about him suggesting he was harboring something impossible inside his body. She approached the bed carefully, studying his features in the low light, looking for some sign of distress or awareness, but found none. He was just an old man struggling with pneumonia, vulnerable and human and entirely ordinary. Michael had moved to the computer terminal in the room and was pulling up Thomas's full medical record, scrolling through pages of notes and lab results and medication orders. Claire watched the monitor above the bed, focusing on the numbers that quantified Thomas Whitmore's existence in this moment. Heart rate 72, blood pressure 130/80, oxygen saturation 94%. Everything was stable. Everything was within acceptable ranges for a man his age with his condition. But she couldn't shake the image of that face from her mind, those terrified eyes staring out from the X-ray, and she wondered what those numbers would look like if the monitors could somehow measure whatever was happening on a level beyond the physical. Michael called her over to the computer, his voice urgent but quiet, and pointed to something in the social history section of Thomas's chart. It mentioned that he had been married for 43 years to a woman named Margaret Whitmore, who had died 6 years ago in a car accident. The details were sparse, just a note from the admitting resident who had taken Thomas's history when he first came to the emergency room, but they were enough to make Claire's skin prickle with goosebumps. Margaret would have been in her late 60s when she died, not her 30s or 40s, but still, the presence of a deceased wife in Thomas's past felt significant somehow, felt like a piece of a puzzle they were only beginning to see. They stood there in the quiet room, two medical professionals trained in science and evidence, trying to reconcile what they knew with what they had seen. Claire found herself studying Thomas's face more closely, looking for some resemblance to the face in the X-ray, but found none. The woman in the image had been younger, with different features, different bone structure. Unless Margaret had looked very different when she was younger, which was possible, this wasn't simply a manifestation of Thomas's grief or memory. Michael suggested they wake him up and ask him directly if he had been experiencing anything unusual, any visions or sensations or awareness of a presence. But Claire hesitated. What would they even say? "Excuse me, Mr. Whitmore, but we found what appears to be a terrified woman's face inside your chest on your X-ray. Do you have any idea what that might be about?" It sounded absurd even thinking it, and yet the image was real, stored now in the hospital's computer system with her initials on it as proof. She decided they should wait until morning, until they could approach this more carefully, maybe with the help of someone from the hospital's ethics committee, or even a chaplain who might have experience with patients reporting unusual spiritual experiences. Michael agreed reluctantly, understanding that waking a sick old man in the middle of the night to ask him about supernatural manifestations might do more harm than good. As they turned to leave, Thomas Whitmore's eyes opened. It happened so suddenly that both Claire and Michael froze, startled by his abrupt return to consciousness. He looked directly at Claire, his gaze clear and focused despite his illness, and spoke in a voice that was surprisingly strong. He asked her if she had seen it, if she had seen her in the picture. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and confirmation. Claire felt her heart hammering in her chest as she slowly approached the bed again, asking Thomas what he meant, who he was talking about. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath that rattled slightly in his congested lungs. and when he opened them again, there were tears gathering in the corners. He said her name was Rebecca, that she had been his daughter, his only daughter who had died when she was 34 years old from breast cancer, 17 years ago. The grief in his voice was fresh despite the passage of time, as raw as if the loss had happened yesterday instead of nearly 2 decades past. He said Rebecca had always been terrified of hospitals, had fought against her treatment until the very end because the clinical environment filled her with such deep fear. She had died at home, in her own bed, because she had refused to spend her final days in a place that scared her so much. Michael had stepped closer now, too, his earlier nervousness replaced by a different kind of intensity, the focused attention of a medical professional encountering something that might actually have an explanation. He asked Thomas gently if Rebecca had ever been a patient at St. Benedict's, if there was some connection between her and this specific hospital. Thomas shook his head slowly, explaining that Rebecca had lived and died in Seattle, had never even visited Portland as far as he knew. But he said something else then that made the hairs on Claire's arms stand up. He said that 3 nights ago, the night before his pneumonia got bad enough to require hospitalization, he had dreamed about Rebecca. In the dream, she had been trying to tell him something urgent, had been following him through the rooms of his house with that same terrified expression on her face, reaching for him but never quite able to touch him. When he woke up, he couldn't remember what she had been trying to say, only that it felt desperately important. The next morning, he had felt the first symptoms of his illness, the tightness in his chest that would eventually bring him here to St. Benedict's intensive care unit. He said he thought maybe Rebecca was trying to warn him, trying to tell him something about what was coming, but he hadn't understood then, and he still didn't understand now. Before you move on with this story, I just want to say something from my heart. If you're still here, still listening, it means this story has touched something in you, some part of you that knows the world is bigger and stranger than we usually admit. That means a lot to me, truly. This channel exists because I believe in these moments, in these stories that sit at the edge of what we can explain. And I believe in the people who are brave enough to explore them with me. If you feel that same pull, that same curiosity mixed with unease, would you consider subscribing? Not because I'm asking, but because you genuinely want to be here for the next story, and the one after that. And please, share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me what you're feeling right now, what this story is making you think about. Your words matter here. Your presence matters. We're building something together, a community of people who aren't afraid to look at the shadows and wonder what's looking back. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Now, let's find out what happens next. Claire spent the next several hours in a strange state of suspended reality, going through the motions of her remaining shift while her mind remained fixed on Thomas Whitmore and the impossible image of his daughter, trapped somehow in the architecture of his body. She processed other patients, took other x-rays, went through all the familiar routines with mechanical efficiency while feeling utterly disconnected from the normalcy of it all. Michael had gone home at the end of his shift, but not before making her promise to call him if anything else happened, if Thomas's condition changed, or if they discovered anything new about the face in the image. She had agreed, though part of her wanted to simply forget the whole thing, to convince herself it had been a trick of shadows or a flaw in the equipment, anything that would let her return to the comfortable certainty of a world governed by physical laws and medical science. But she knew she couldn't do that, knew that what they had seen was real and significant, and deserving of understanding, even if that understanding took them into territory that made no logical sense. When her shift ended at 7 in the morning, instead of going home as she normally would, Claire found herself walking back to the intensive care unit. The hospital was coming alive with the day shift change, nurses and doctors and support staff filling the hallways with their purposeful movement and professional conversations. In the harsh morning light streaming through the windows, everything seemed so ordinary, so firmly rooted in the material world, that Claire almost convinced herself she had imagined the whole thing. But then she pushed open the door to Thomas Whitmore's room and saw him sitting up slightly, awake and alert, watching the door as if he had been waiting for her. His color looked better in the daylight. The oxygen mask removed and replaced with a simple nasal cannula, his breathing easier than it had been during the night. He greeted her by name even though she had never formally introduced herself, and when she looked surprised, he explained that he had read her name badge during one of his brief moments of awareness when she had transferred him for the X-ray. He asked her to sit down, gesturing to the chair beside his bed with a hand that trembled only slightly, and she found herself obeying without question. Thomas spoke in a measured way, taking his time to gather his thoughts and his breath between sentences. He told her that he had been seeing Rebecca for the past 6 months, not in dreams, but in waking moments. Brief flashes of her face appearing in reflections and shadows, and sometimes just in his peripheral vision. At first, he had thought it was grief playing tricks on his mind, the normal hallucinations that sometimes came with age and loneliness and too many memories. But the sightings had become more frequent and more urgent over time, and Rebecca's expression had always been the same, that look of terror mixed with desperate need to communicate something. He had mentioned it once to his son during a phone call, trying to make light of it, suggesting maybe he was finally losing his mind after all these years of holding it together. His son had laughed nervously and suggested he talk to his doctor, maybe adjust his medications. But Thomas had never followed through because he wasn't entirely sure he wanted the visions to stop. They were his last connection to his daughter, however strange and unsettling they might be, and part of him was grateful for them even as they frightened him. But then, 3 nights ago, the dream had been different, more vivid and more insistent than any of the waking visions. Rebecca had appeared to him not as a fleeting image, but as a full presence, solid and real, standing in his bedroom in the middle of the night. She had been wearing the same clothes she had died in, comfortable pajamas with a floral pattern, and her face had been contorted with that same fear, but also with determination. She had tried to speak to him, her mouth moving urgently, but no sound had come out, as if some barrier existed between them that allowed sight but not sound. Thomas had reached for her, had actually felt his hand pass through the space where she appeared to be standing, finding only air and a strange coldness that made his fingers ache. And then she had done something that he still couldn't fully explain or understand. She had placed her hand, or the ghost of her hand, against his chest, right over his heart, and he had felt a pressure there, a sensation of something entering him or settling into him. It hadn't hurt exactly, but it had been profoundly uncomfortable, like swallowing something too large or breathing in water. When he woke up the next morning, the pressure was still there, a weight in his chest that he initially attributed to the beginning of his pneumonia, but now wondered if it might be something else entirely. Claire listened to all of this with a mixture of professional skepticism and personal belief, the two sides of her nature warring within her. The medical professional in her wanted to attribute Thomas's experiences to the early stages of his illness, perhaps a lack of oxygen to the brain causing hallucinations, or even the beginning of delirium that sometimes affected elderly patients in hospitals. But another part of her, the part that had been raised on her grandmother's stories of miracles and spirits, and the thin places where the living and the dead could touch, believed every word. She told Thomas about the X-ray, about the face they had found in the image, and watched his reaction carefully. He didn't seem surprised, didn't show the shock or disbelief that a person might normally express when told something so impossible. Instead, he simply nodded, as if this confirmation was something he had been expecting, and asked if the face had looked frightened. When Claire confirmed that it had, that the expression was one of pure terror, Thomas closed his eyes and let out a long breath that seemed to carry years of accumulated sorrow. He told her then about the real story of Rebecca's death, the parts he had never shared with his son or his friends or anyone else because they were too painful and too private. Rebecca had died at home, as he had said, but she hadn't died peacefully. The cancer had spread to her bones in the final weeks, creating pain that even the strongest medications could barely touch. She had been afraid not just of hospitals, but of death itself, had clung to consciousness and life with a desperation that Thomas found both admirable and heartbreaking. In her last hours, when the morphine finally began to win its battle against her will to stay awake, she had gripped his hand with surprising strength and told him she wasn't ready, that there was something she needed to say or do or understand before she could let go. But the drugs and the disease had stolen her words before she could explain, and she had slipped away with her message undelivered, her terror unresolved. Thomas had carried that moment with him for 17 years, had replayed it countless times wondering what she had needed to tell him, what final piece of communication had been lost in that transition between life and death. And now, somehow, she was back. Or at least some part of her was back, using his body as a vessel to make herself known again. Claire felt tears forming in her own eyes as she listened, moved by the raw grief in Thomas's voice, and by the impossible situation they found themselves in. She asked him what he thought Rebecca was trying to communicate now. What message could be so important that it would transcend death itself and manifest as a visible presence in a medical image? Thomas was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands folded on the blanket covering his lap, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He said he thought Rebecca was trying to warn him, trying to tell him that he was in danger, that whatever was happening to him in this hospital room went beyond simple pneumonia. He said he had felt wrong since the moment he arrived at St. Benedict's, had felt watched and studied by something that wasn't quite human, something that moved through the hallways at night when the staff thought all the patients were sleeping. He had heard voices that didn't match any of the nurses or doctors he had met, had seen shadows that moved independently of any light source, and had felt presences standing at the foot of his bed in the darkest hours before dawn. He had convinced himself these were fever dreams or medication side effects, but now, knowing that Rebecca had made herself visible in his X-ray, he wondered if she was trying to show him that the danger was real, that something in this place wanted something from him, and she was doing her best to protect him, even from beyond death. The room suddenly felt colder, or maybe it was just Claire's perception shifting as Thomas's words settled over her like a weight. She thought about St. Benedict's Regional Hospital, about its long history and the thousands of people who had passed through its doors over the decades. How many of them had died here? How many stories and sorrows and unfinished business might linger in its walls and corridors? She thought about the other strange things she had witnessed during her 7 years working night shifts, things she had dismissed or rationalized, but that now seemed potentially connected to whatever Thomas was describing. The elevator that sometimes stopped on floors where no one had pressed a button, the medication room where supplies would rearrange themselves overnight, the occasional patient who would insist they had been visited by deceased relatives who told them things they couldn't possibly know. She had always attributed these incidents to coincidence or confusion, or the natural strangeness of working in a building where so much life and death intersected. But what if there was more to it? What if St. Benedict's was one of those thin places her grandmother used to talk about, where the boundary between worlds became permeable and things could slip through from one side to the other? I want to pause here for just a moment. Not because the story is over, but because I need to ask you something. Have you ever experienced something like this? Something you couldn't explain? Something that made you question the solid reality you thought you lived in? If you have, I want to hear about it. Please, share your story in the comments below. This community we're building together is more than just people watching videos. It's people who understand that the world is full of mysteries we're only beginning to acknowledge. Your experiences matter, your stories matter, and they might help someone else feel less alone in their own strange encounters. And if you have ideas for future stories, themes you want me to explore, or questions you want addressed, tell me those too. This channel belongs to all of us, and I want it to reflect what genuinely interests and moves you. Thank you for being part of this journey, for having the courage to sit with discomfort and wonder instead of turning away. Now let's see where this story takes us next. Claire made a decision that would violate every protocol in her training manual. She told Thomas she believed him, that she believed Rebecca was trying to warn him, and that they needed to figure out what the danger was before it manifested into something more than a feeling or a shadow. She asked for his permission to investigate further, to look into the hospital's records and perhaps talk to other staff members who worked the night shifts, to see if anyone else had noticed anything unusual about St. Benedict's after dark. Thomas agreed immediately, relief washing over his features at having someone take his concerns seriously, rather than dismissing them as the confused ramblings of a sick old man. Claire left his room with a sense of purpose that felt almost reckless, knowing she was stepping far outside the boundaries of her job description, but unable to ignore the pull of something that felt profoundly important. She started in the hospital's medical records department, using her staff credentials to access files she technically had permission to view, but no real reason to be examining. She pulled up death records for the past year, looking for patterns or anomalies, anything that might suggest something unusual happening within the hospital's walls. What she found disturbed her more than she wanted to admit. There had been 17 unexpected deaths in the past 12 months, patients whose conditions had not been critical, but who had nevertheless coded suddenly and failed to respond to resuscitation efforts. 17 was not an alarming number in isolation. Hospitals saw death regularly, and unexpected complications were part of the reality of medical care. But when Claire looked closer at the details, she noticed something strange. All 17 deaths had occurred during night shifts, and more specifically, all had occurred between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning. That narrow window of time when the hospital was at its quietest, when staff was at its minimum and most patients were deeply asleep. And even stranger, all 17 patients had been admitted to rooms on either the 4th floor where the intensive care unit was located, or the 6th floor which housed the oncology ward. The same 2 floors, the same 2-hour window, 17 times in 1 year. Claire felt a chill run through her as she stared at the data on the screen, understanding that what she was seeing went beyond coincidence into the realm of pattern, and pattern implied intention. She printed the records carefully, folding the pages and slipping them into her bag before anyone could question what she was doing. Her next stop was the cafeteria, where she knew she would find Janet Holloway, a nurse who had worked at St. Benedict's for over 20 years, and who had a reputation for knowing everything that happened in the hospital, official and otherwise. She found Janet sitting alone at a corner table, nursing a cup of coffee and looking exhausted in the way that only night shift workers understood. That bone-deep tiredness that came from forcing your body to function when every cell was screaming for sleep. Claire sat down across from her without asking permission and launched directly into her questions, trusting that Janet's experience and discretion would keep their conversation confidential. Janet listened without interrupting as Claire explained about Thomas Whitmore's X-ray, about the face they had found, and Thomas's story about his daughter Rebecca trying to warn him. She watched Janet's expression shift from skepticism to recognition, to something that looked almost like relief, as if Claire had finally given voice to concerns Janet herself had been harboring but was afraid to express. When Claire finished speaking, Janet was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee with slow, deliberate movements that seemed designed to give her time to decide how much to reveal. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and careful, telling Claire that she wasn't the first person to notice something wrong at St. Benedict's, that there had been others over the years who had asked questions or raised concerns, but had been dismissed or transferred, or had simply quit rather than continue working in an environment that felt increasingly threatening. Janet said she had personally witnessed 3 of the 17 unexpected deaths Claire had found in the records, had been the responding nurse when the codes were called, and in each case, she had felt something in the room with them as they tried to save the patient, something that seemed to be actively working against their efforts. She described it as a presence, cold and hungry and patient, something that moved through the hospital's infrastructure like a predator stalking prey. She said she had felt it in the way lights would flicker at crucial moments during resuscitation attempts, in the way equipment would malfunction just when it was needed most, in the sensation of being watched by eyes that had no physical form. Other nurses had reported similar experiences, whispering about them in the break room but never filing official reports because they knew how it would sound, how quickly they would be labeled as stressed or superstitious or mentally unstable. Janet said the hospital administration either didn't know or didn't care, focused as they were on metrics and outcomes and maintaining St. Benedict's reputation as a quality care facility. But the nurses knew. The ones who spent their nights in those quiet corridors with the dying and the desperate, they knew something was fundamentally wrong. And they knew it was getting worse, that the frequency of these incidents had increased over the past year, as if whatever haunted St. Benedict's was growing stronger or bolder or more desperate in its hunger. Claire asked the question that had been forming in her mind since she first saw Rebecca's face in the X-ray. What did this presence want? What was the purpose of these deaths if they were indeed being caused by something supernatural rather than medical coincidence? Janet's answer was both simple and terrifying. She said she thought it fed on fear, that it was drawn to patients who were already frightened and vulnerable, who carried unresolved trauma or grief that made them more permeable to spiritual influence. The oncology patients fit that profile perfectly. People facing their mortality with whatever complicated emotions that brought up, and the intensive care patients were often in states of consciousness that blurred the line between life and death, making them easier targets. Janet said she thought the presence had been at St. Benedict's for a long time, maybe since the hospital was first built on this land 70 years ago, but something had changed recently to make it more active. She didn't know what that change was, didn't have answers, only observations and suspicions, but she knew in her bones that Thomas Whitmore was in danger, that whatever Rebecca was trying to warn him about was real and imminent. The two women sat in the cafeteria as the morning stretched toward afternoon, hospital life flowing around them while they discussed impossible things in practical tones. They formulated a plan that felt inadequate but was all they could manage given their limited understanding. Claire would stay with Thomas as much as possible, would monitor him not just medically, but spiritually, watching for signs that the presence Janet described was focusing its attention on him. Janet would talk to the other nurses she trusted, would create an informal network of people watching and protecting the patients on the 4th and 6th floors during those dangerous hours between 2 and 4 in the morning. They both knew this was far outside the scope of their professional responsibilities, that they were putting themselves at risk professionally and perhaps personally, but neither could walk away knowing what they knew. Claire thought about Rebecca's terrified face in the X-ray, about a daughter's love that transcended death itself to try to protect her father, and she knew she had to honor that love with action. When Claire returned to Thomas's room later that afternoon, she found his condition had deteriorated significantly. His breathing had become labored again despite the oxygen, his fever had spiked to dangerous levels, and his blood pressure had dropped enough that the attending physician had ordered additional monitoring and medication adjustments. But more concerning than the physical symptoms was the change in Thomas's demeanor. The calm acceptance he had shown earlier had been replaced by visible agitation, his eyes darting around the room as if tracking something invisible to everyone else, his hands gripping the bed rails with white-knuckled intensity. When he saw Claire, relief flooded his face and he reached for her with desperate urgency, pulling her close enough that she could hear his whispered words over the noise of the medical equipment. He told her it was here, that the thing Rebecca had been trying to warn him about was in the room with them right now, that he could feel it pressing against him like physical weight trying to push its way inside. He said Rebecca was still there too, still trying to protect him, and he could sense them struggling against each other, two forces battling for possession of his failing body. Claire looked around the room, seeing nothing unusual with her physical eyes, but feeling something nonetheless, a thickness to the air that made it harder to breathe, a coldness that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. She thought about calling for help, about alerting the medical staff to Thomas's deteriorating condition. But she knew they would only see the physical symptoms, would only treat the pneumonia and ignore the spiritual crisis that was the real source of his distress. Instead, she did something that surprised even herself. She reached for Thomas's hand with one of her own and for the silver cross around her neck with the other, and she began to pray. Not with any formal words or theological sophistication, but with simple, desperate honesty, asking whatever benevolent force might exist in the universe to protect this frightened old man, and to honor the love of a daughter who refused to abandon her father, even in death. She prayed for Rebecca to be strong enough to hold back whatever darkness was threatening Thomas, and she prayed for wisdom to know what else she could do to help them both. The hospital room began to change as Claire prayed, subtle shifts that she registered more through intuition than clear observation. The air seemed to thicken further and then suddenly clear, as if something that had been present withdrew or dissipated. Thomas's grip on her hand loosened, and his breathing, while still labored from the pneumonia, lost some of its desperate quality. His eyes stopped darting around the room and focused instead on something directly in front of him, something at the foot of his bed that Claire couldn't see, but that brought tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. He spoke then, addressing someone who wasn't visible, telling Rebecca that he understood now, that he finally heard what she had been trying to say all along. He told her he knew she had been afraid, that she had died with words unspoken and terror unresolved, but that her fear had transformed into something else through her love for him. He said he understood that she had been warning him not about some external danger, but about his own readiness to let go, his own quiet acceptance of death that had been growing stronger over the months since her visits began. He realized now that Rebecca had been terrified not for herself, but for him, afraid that he was giving up too easily, surrendering to loneliness and grief without fighting for the life he still had left to live. Thomas spoke through his tears, his voice gaining strength even as his body remained weak, telling Rebecca that he heard her message now, that he understood she needed him to choose life, to fight against the darkness that fed on resignation and despair. He said he had been so tired for so long, carrying the weight of her death and his wife's death, and all the accumulated losses that come with reaching the end of a long life. And somewhere along the way, he had stopped believing his existence mattered to anyone. But seeing her face in that X-ray, knowing she had found a way to reach across the barrier of death itself to warn him and protect him, had shown him that love didn't end when breathing stopped, that the connections between people persisted beyond any physical limitation. He told her he would fight, that he would push back against whatever presence haunted these halls looking for vulnerable souls to consume, and that he would live not just for himself, but for her memory, honoring her desperate effort to save him by choosing to be saved. Claire watched Thomas speaking to his invisible daughter, tears flowing down her own face now as she witnessed something that transcended all her medical training and rational understanding. She felt the moment when something shifted fundamentally in the room, when the spiritual battle that had been waging resolved itself not through violence or dramatic confrontation, but through the simple power of a choice made and a love acknowledged. The monitors around Thomas's bed showed his vital signs beginning to stabilize, his heart rate settling into a steadier rhythm, his oxygen saturation climbing back toward acceptable levels. It was as if his body was responding to his emotional decision, as if the pneumonia that had brought him to the hospital's edge was retreating in the face of his renewed will to live. The attending physician would later attribute the improvement to the antibiotics finally taking effect, to the natural progression of treatment and recovery, and Claire would let him maintain that comfortable explanation, even as she knew the truth was far stranger and more beautiful. Thomas turned to Claire then, his eyes clear despite the tears still wet on his cheeks, and thanked her for believing him, for taking his fears seriously when it would have been easier to dismiss them as delirium or medication side effects. He said Rebecca was gone now, that he couldn't see or feel her presence anymore, but that he knew she was finally at peace. Whatever terror had trapped her spirit for 17 years, Whatever unfinished business had kept her tethered to a world she had left behind had been resolved through this final act of protection and communication. She had delivered her message, had saved her father from giving up, and now she could rest, knowing he would carry her love forward into whatever time he had remaining. Claire asked Thomas what he had seen at the end, what Rebecca had looked like in those final moments of visibility, and his answer made her breath catch. He said she had been smiling, that the terror had left her face completely, replaced by an expression of pure joy and relief that reminded him of how she had looked as a child when she accomplished something difficult, that mixture of pride and happiness and peaceful exhaustion. The days that followed brought Thomas a recovery that his doctors called remarkable, though not miraculous, the kind of improvement that fell within the bounds of medical possibility, even if it was on the optimistic end of expected outcomes. His pneumonia resolved with continued treatment, his strength gradually returned, and within a week he was transferred out of intensive care to a regular medical floor. Claire visited him during her shifts, bringing him cups of weak hospital coffee and listening to his stories about Rebecca as a child, the memories he had guarded so carefully for years, suddenly ready to be shared and celebrated, rather than mourned in solitude. He told her about teaching Rebecca to ride a bicycle, about her fear of falling transformed into exhilaration when she finally found her balance. He told her about Rebecca's wedding day, about walking her down the aisle feeling both pride and the bittersweet awareness of time passing. He told her about sitting beside Rebecca's hospital bed in Seattle during her final weeks, holding her hand and reading to her from books she had loved as a child, trying to give her comfort in a place that terrified her. Each story he shared felt like a small act of healing, a way of honoring Rebecca's life rather than being imprisoned by her death. Claire never told Thomas about the other discoveries she and Janet had made, about the pattern of unexpected deaths or the presence that seemed to haunt St. Benedict's corridors. She didn't want to burden him with knowledge that would only bring more fear, and besides, something had changed after that night in Thomas's room. Janet reported that the deaths on the 4th and 6th floors had stopped, that the dangerous hours between 2 and 4 in the morning felt less oppressive, less charged with malevolent attention. Some of the other nurses noticed it too, commenting in the break room about how the hospital felt lighter somehow, as if a weight they hadn't fully been conscious of carrying had been lifted. Claire wondered if Rebecca's successful intervention had somehow disrupted the presence's feeding pattern, if her demonstration of love's power had weakened its hold on the hospital's vulnerable patients. She had no way to prove this theory, no way to measure or document the absence of something that should never have existed in the first place, but she felt it in her bones the way Janet had felt the presence itself, a knowing that transcended evidence. Michael contacted her several times during that week, asking about Thomas and about whether anything else unusual had appeared in subsequent X-rays. Claire told him about Thomas's recovery, but kept the deeper spiritual details to herself, knowing they sounded too fantastical to be believable without having lived through the experience. She did tell him that the face in the original X-ray had never been adequately explained, that it remained in the hospital's records as an anomaly without official comment or investigation. Michael said he had done some research into similar cases, into medical images that captured impossible things, and had found scattered reports throughout the literature of faces appearing in scans, of shadows that resembled human forms in ultrasounds, of patterns in MRIs that looked disturbingly intentional. The medical establishment dismissed these as pareidolia or equipment artifacts, the same explanations Claire herself would have used before meeting Thomas Whitmore, but Michael wondered if there was something more to them, if medical imaging technology, with its ability to see inside the human body, might sometimes capture spiritual realities alongside physical ones. On the day Thomas was discharged from St. Benedict's, 3 weeks after his admission, Claire was there to say goodbye. He looked transformed from the frightened elderly man who had arrived struggling to breathe, standing now with better posture and clearer eyes, his sons on either side of him helping carry his belongings, but not having to support his weight. He thanked the nurses and doctors who had treated him, expressing genuine gratitude for their medical skill and attention. and then he asked specifically for Claire. When she came to his room, he embraced her with surprising strength, holding her for a long moment before pulling back to look at her directly. He told her that she had saved his life, not through any medical intervention, but through the simple act of witnessing and believing, of standing with him in his fear instead of explaining it away. He said he was going back to Seattle to live near his sons, that he was done with the loneliness of his house in Portland and ready to spend his remaining years surrounded by family who loved him. He promised to light a candle for Rebecca every week to maintain the connection they had reestablished through such strange circumstances and to live fully in honor of her desperate effort to keep him alive. Claire walked Thomas and his sons to the hospital's main entrance, watching as they loaded his bags into the car and helped him settle into the passenger seat. Before they drove away, Thomas rolled down the window and called to her one last time. He told her to keep praying, to keep believing in the reality of things that couldn't be measured or documented in medical charts. He said the world needed people like her who could stand in the intersection between science and spirit, who could honor both without reducing one to the other. And then he said something that would stay with Claire for the rest of her life. He said that Rebecca had told him something in those final moments of visibility, a message meant specifically for Claire. She had wanted Claire to know that her grandmother, who had given her the Silver Cross, was proud of her, was watching over her still, and that the work Claire was doing mattered more than she realized. Thomas couldn't explain how Rebecca would have known about Claire's grandmother, had no rational explanation to offer, but Claire didn't need one. She felt the truth of the message settle over her like a blessing, felt the presence of her grandmother as tangibly as she had felt the presence of darkness in Thomas's hospital room, and she knew that everything she had experienced was real and significant, and exactly what she was meant to encounter. After Thomas's car disappeared from view, Claire stood for a moment in the autumn sunshine outside St. Benedict's main entrance, feeling the weight of her profession and her calling in new ways. She thought about all the patients who would come through these doors in the weeks and months and years ahead, about the ones who would carry fears and griefs and unfinished business that made them vulnerable to whatever darkness might be waiting. She thought about her responsibility not just to their bodies, but to their wholeness, to the totality of their human experience that included dimensions medicine barely acknowledged. She touched the silver cross at her neck, feeling its familiar weight, and made a silent promise to her grandmother and to Rebecca and to Thomas and to herself. She would stay vigilant, would watch for the signs of spiritual distress alongside physical symptoms, and would honor the truth that healing sometimes required faith as much as it required medicine. She didn't know if she would encounter anything like Thomas's case again, didn't know if the presence Janet had described would return or remain dormant, but she knew she was ready now in ways she hadn't been before. The automatic doors slid open behind her as someone exited the hospital, and Claire turned to go back inside, back to her work and her rounds and the endless cycle of illness and recovery that defined life within St. Benedict's walls. But as she crossed the threshold, she paused and looked back one more time at the street where Thomas's car had disappeared, at the ordinary Tuesday afternoon traffic and the people going about their normal lives. She wondered how many of them carried invisible burdens like Thomas had, how many struggled with grief that manifested in physical illness, how many were visited by the dead who loved them enough to break through the barriers of mortality. She wondered if the world was full of small miracles happening constantly just beneath the surface of ordinary life, sacred moments that went unnoticed, because people were too committed to rational explanations to acknowledge the evidence of their own experiences. And she decided then that she would spend the rest of her career paying attention, really paying attention, to all the things that happened in the spaces between diagnosis and treatment, in the quiet hours when defenses were down and the boundary between worlds grew thin. Claire returned to the radiology department where her next shift would begin in a few hours, where she would take hundreds more X-rays of hundreds more patients, each image a window into the hidden architecture of human bodies. She pulled up Thomas Whitmore's original scan one more time, studying Rebecca's face in the digital file, memorizing the details of her terror and her determination. Then she did something that violated protocol, but felt necessary. She saved a copy of the image to a secure personal drive, preserving it not as medical evidence but as a reminder, a touchstone for the reality of what she had witnessed. She knew that months or years from now, when the vividness of this experience had faded and the comfortable certainties of routine had reasserted themselves, she might need to look at this image again and remember that the impossible was real, that love persisted beyond death, and that sometimes the most important healing happened in dimensions no machine could measure. As she logged out of the system and prepared for her shift, Claire felt different than she had just 3 weeks ago, transformed not dramatically, but fundamentally by her encounter with Thomas and Rebecca and the mysterious presence that haunted St. Benedict's halls. She had begun this experience as a competent technician who took pride in her technical skill and her professional efficiency, and she remained those things. But she was also something more now, a witness to mystery, a guardian standing watch in the liminal spaces where medicine and meaning intersected. She didn't have all the answers, didn't fully understand what had happened or why, but she had learned that not all questions required answers, that sometimes it was enough to simply acknowledge the question and sit with the uncertainty it brought. She had learned that fear could be transformed into love, that the dead could speak to the living through X-rays and dreams and desperate acts of protection, and that choosing life in the face of darkness was itself a kind of miracle. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant song overhead. The machines waited ready for their next task, and the hospital continued its eternal rhythm of crisis and comfort, suffering and healing. Claire took a deep breath, touched her grandmother's cross one more time, and stepped forward into the work that waited. She would take her X-rays and process her images and document her findings in careful professional language that would never capture the whole truth of what she witnessed. But she would know, and Thomas would know, and somewhere beyond the boundaries of this world, Rebecca would know that her message had been received, her warning had been heeded, and her love had accomplished exactly what she had intended. That would be enough. That would have to be enough. And in the quiet moments between patients, in the liminal hours when the hospital held its breath waiting for dawn, Claire would remember and watch and believe. In the end, perhaps the real miracle was fear.